dedicated to delivering value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today we're exploring The Age of Anti-Intellectualism, subtitled Lies in American Culture. This book deeply examines the anti-intellectualism permeating American society. Anti-intellectualism refers to a social mindset that blindly rejects scientific rationality, dismisses expertise, celebrates mediocrity, and even glorifies ignorance. The concept of anti-intellectualism was first proposed by American historian Richard Hofstadter. Back in 1963, Hofstadter published Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, critiquing these tendencies in society then. 40 years later, anti-intellectualism in America hasn't faded, it's gotten worse. A 2014 National Science Foundation study found 1 in 4 American adults believes the sun orbits the Earth. Pew Research Center's 2005 survey showed 3/4 of Americans reject Darwin's evolution theory. This isn't just average Americans. Even top U.S. politicians display anti-intellectual tendencies. For example, President George W. Bush supported teaching creationism in schools and claimed divine guidance for invading Iraq. President Trump frequently expressed contempt for experts and specialized knowledge. He refused protective glasses during a solar eclipse, declaring real men stare directly at the sun. He called global warming a hoax fabricated by experts. He claimed COVID was just a bad flu that self-heals. How did this happen? Why is anti-intellectualism intensifying across America? That's the core question this book tackles. Author Susan Jacoby is an independent scholar, speaker, and contributor to the New York Times and Washington Post, specializing in atheism and secularism. Thus, the age of anti-intellectualism represents her decades-long diagnosis of America's cultural illness. The main part of this book was written between 2001 and 2008, during George W. Bush's presidency. At that time, anti-intellectualism in American society was unprecedentedly high. The author Jacoby, along with many historians and journalists, believed that anti-intellectualism in America had reached its peak. However, history over the next decade proved that the author was overly optimistic back then. In 2016, after Trump's election, the author added some content and republished the book. He explicitly pointed out that mainstream media failed to predict Trump's win because they didn't grasp the deep historical and social roots of anti-intellectualism. He hopes this book provides an academic perspective to expose anti-intellectualism's true roots and awaken public vigilance against it. And after The Age of Anti-Intellectualism was published, it got rave reviews from mainstream American media. The Chicago Tribune stated that Jacoby's compelling and passionate arguments sounded a societal alarm worth serious attention. The Buffalo News called it an indispensable book, a denunciation of 21st century foolishness, and a monumental work. For us, this book holds crucial reference value for understanding contemporary American political and sociocultural trends. In the book, Jacoby summarizes 3 main factors driving anti-intellectualism in America: religious, political, and public cultural factors. Next, I'll interpret them one by one. First, let's look at the religious factor. The author believes this is the most fundamental cause of anti-intellectualism's prevalence. Anti-intellectualism in America isn't new, it's rooted in history, stemming from Christian fundamentalism. Christian fundamentalism is an extremely conservative faction within Christianity. This faction insists on interpreting everything very strictly according to its literal meaning. They believe every word in the Bible is true, and every sentence is a creed personally ordained by God. Thus, fundamentalists reject any secularization or scientification of religion, even despising evolutionary theory. For example, since the Bible says Earth is only 4,000 years old, fundamentalists ignore all geological evidence and spread this belief. For other nearly mythical accounts in the Bible, fundamentalists accept them all, believing every story is a real event, not metaphors or symbols. Christian fundamentalism in America hasn't always existed. Before the 19th century, almost all Americans devoutly believed everything in the Bible was absolute truth, so fundamentalism wasn't needed. But by the early 19th century, science advanced rapidly, with discoveries challenging the Bible and diminishing Christianity's authority. At this point, Christians influenced by Enlightenment ideas started reconciling religious doctrines with science, using rational interpretations. For example, they interpreted the 4,000 years as God's definition of civilization history, compromising with modern science. And however, some conservative Christians couldn't accept this historical shift. They organized and attacked modern science fiercely, forming Christian fundamentalism. Unsurprisingly, fundamentalists hate evolution most. It overturns the Bible's creation story, undermining its foundation. Thus, a key goal of fundamentalists is to prevent teaching evolution in schools. They can do this due to America's unique education system. For instance, European countries have national curricula, so all children learn the same science and culture. But America isn't like that. As covered in like a comet across the night sky, since its founding, America has had limited central power but strong local authority. In the U.S., each state has its own laws, judiciary, and independent textbooks and education policies. This allows extreme religious groups to influence public education in some areas, causing disparities in content and quality across regions. In economically developed northern U.S., the education system is controlled by Enlightenment-minded elites, focusing on modern science and culture. In less developed areas, mainly in the American South, education and perspectives were already relatively backward. This made their education systems more easily controlled by fundamentalists with outdated ideologies. What children learned included substantial anti-science and anti-rational content. In the 1830s at Columbia College in South Carolina, President Thomas Cooper was accused of heresy and fired by local authorities for opposing religious-based curriculum. Even into the 1920s, after World War I, many southern states still banned teaching evolution in public schools. In 1925, Tennessee, a high school teacher named Scopes was prosecuted for teaching evolution. In court, a jury of fundamentalists found him guilty. Under these conditions, education in underdeveloped regions lagged behind for over 200 years, creating a vicious cycle of entrenched anti-science, anti-rational social atmosphere. Now, the author lamented that since America's founding, anti-intellectual forces have been rooted in the rift between religion and education. During the 1930s to 40s, World War II made religious issues seem less prominent. But by the 1960s, Christian fundamentalism resurged powerfully in America. Starting in the 60s, America entered the fervent civil rights era, with masses protesting for racial or gender equality and opposing U.S. government actions in the Vietnam War, opposed Cold War arms escalation, then opposed all mainstream American culture. All these movements shared a core theme: opposing established authority, social structures, and lifestyles. This made conservative Christian fundamentalists feel profoundly threatened because they advocated preserving ancient authority and traditional lifestyles centered entirely on religious faith. But somehow, thus, Christian fundamentalism began aggressively expanding again. The author notes that in the 1960s, fundamentalists quietly expanded their influence across the South and nationwide, establishing a Christian school network from kindergarten to university. In what? Found it. Northern elites, preoccupied with civil rights, overlooked these critical changes in Southern and national education systems. A Thomas B. Fordham Foundation report at the turn of the century found over 1/3 of U.S. states, mainly Southern and Midwestern, don't teach basic evolution facts. Moreover, fundamentalists display hostility toward nearly all modern scientific knowledge. For instance, they claim condoms can't prevent HIV transmission, believing AIDS is divine punishment, so the only solution is controlling desires and devout faith. Unsurprisingly, in such environments, many Americans lag far behind European or Asian peers in scientific literacy. A 2003 Economist survey concluded Americans believing in the virgin birth outnumber evolution believers 2 to 1. The magazine noted this as baffling even to religious Europeans. National Science Foundation surveys show over 2/3 of Americans don't know DNA is key hereditary material. Over 90% don't understand radiation. A 1998 University of Texas survey revealed a quarter of U.S. biology teachers believe humans coexisted with dinosaurs, reflecting fundamental education failures. The author believes this stems largely from religious fundamentalism's pervasive influence. Thus concludes the first factor, extreme Christian fundamentalism that instills irrational education, laying anti-intellectualism's foundation. Beyond religious extremism, the author argues America developed extreme conservative political forces that amplify anti-intellectualism alongside fundamentalism. Now let's discuss the second major factor driving anti-intellectualism in America. Political factors. The author identifies the main political force promoting anti-intellectualism as the extreme right-wing faction within the Republican Party. Many Republican supporters come from the South and Midwest. If you follow U.S. presidential elections, you'll notice these regions contain traditional Republican strongholds. As mentioned earlier, these areas are more susceptible to fundamentalist influence, promoting anti-science and anti-rational views. Thus, advocating anti-intellectualism helps Republican politicians solidify their base. More importantly, many fundamentalists actively join the Republican Party. They consider spreading fundamentalist values widely across America their sacred mission. They aim to transform their extreme conservative values into social institutions through political engagement, making all Americans comply and believe. Since the 1980s, Christian fundamentalists actively infiltrated the Republican Party, greatly increasing their political influence. So, in the early 1980s, Republican Ronald Reagan openly courted conservative Christian voters during his campaign, marking the merger of conservative political and religious forces. By the 1990s, this merger deepened further. In the early 2000s, during George W. Bush's presidency, conservative religious infiltration of American politics peaked. For example, Bush appointed 2 extremely conservative fundamentalists to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the early 2000s, fundamentalists established Patrick Henry University about 80 kilometers from Washington, D.C. This extremely conservative ideological Christian university aimed to train fundamentalist political elites for government roles. Thus, Patrick Henry University imposed strict religious requirements on students. Most students were homeschooled by devout parents before college, raised as staunch fundamentalists. In 2004, many staffers for Bush's re-election campaign came from this university. Since the start of the 21st century, the link between religious and political leanings has grown tighter for ordinary Americans. A study found that the more devoutly religious a voter is, the more they support conservative Republican politicians. For instance, in the 2004 presidential election, those who went to church weekly overwhelmingly voted for Republican candidate George W. Bush, whereas those who attended church just a few times a year mostly voted for the Democratic candidate. Kerry. In actual governance, the Bush administration displayed clear anti-science and anti-rational tendencies. In 2001, early in Bush's term, PBS aired a documentary series called Evolution. This documentary's pro-science stance infuriated fundamentalists. Due to their meddling, the series wasn't used in schools as planned teaching material and even triggered a Bush administration investigation. Absurdly, the investigation's stated reason was to counter perceived bias against religious beliefs in public TV. Soon after, the Bush administration cut government funding for public TV programs. In 2017, Trump's second year as president, he pushed to abolish the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. In America, both foundations are crucial government bodies. The National Endowment for the Humanities focuses on grants for research projects and resources for cultural institutions. The National Endowment for the Arts funds art projects like concerts, book clubs, performances, and exhibitions. It's easy to see that canceling these agencies would devastate cultural development in American society. To attack Democratic candidates and win votes, extreme conservative Republicans exploit the Southern underclass's low education and poor science literacy, stirring hostility toward intellectuals to create a mass anti-intellectual mood. In this anti-intellectual climate, Democratic candidates increasingly fear the elite label to gain more votes. For example, in 2004, Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry crafted an ordinary person image to hide his elite background. To that end, he deliberately wore camouflage for hunting and even affected a rough accent. Yet, despite this, Republicans still portrayed him as a pedantic, hypocritical intellectual. This was indeed a major reason he lost the 2004 presidential election. Yes, you heard that right. In America's anti-intellectual climate, knowledge and reading aren't virtues anymore, they're flaws to hide. This shows the sheer power of America's anti-intellectual political forces. That concludes the second major factor driving anti-intellectualism in America.
Political factors.
The author argues that extreme conservative politics combined with Christian fundamentalism pushed anti-intellectualism to its peak. In this atmosphere, where anti-intellectualists strut while knowledgeable people hide, America's public culture grows increasingly anti-intellectual. Next, let's examine the public cultural factors driving anti-intellectualism. In the book, the author reviews the evolution of America's public cultural environment over the past century. He notes that from the early 20th century until the 1950s, American public culture centered on middlebrow culture. This middlebrow culture sat between aristocratic refinement and folksy simplicity, neither too highbrow nor too lowbrow. It valued diligence and belief in personal striving. Thus, it championed lifestyles fostering effort, loving books and science, valuing rational thinking, and habits of self-education and improvement. Before the 1950s, many middle-class American homes embodied this culture, filled with books and periodicals, with library cards for all family members over 14. Parents emphasized formal education while cultivating interests in history, current affairs, classical arts, and the pursuit of truth and refined tastes. But by the 1960s, this middlebrow culture began declining. One key reason for this decline was the rise of television media. From early 1950s to early 1960s, U.S. TV ownership jumped from 9% to 90%, rapidly transforming America's cultural fabric. Since most TV programming was entertainment-focused, promoting youth culture and celebrity culture. So as TV spread, daily life became increasingly dominated by these popular trends. This profoundly shifted public cultural values. Diligent striving was marginalized while instant gratification became mainstream. When TV first emerged, many intellectuals thought it could spread elite culture more widely. They believed networks could use entertainment profits to subsidize serious programming. But history proved that as TV entertainment grew, society's willingness and ability to read serious books plummeted. To compete, post-1960s newspapers shifted from in-depth reporting to short, sensational stories, celebrity gossip, and titillating scandals. The author sharply notes that print and TV media differ not in content, but in context. In TV-dominated contexts, images and noise consume nearly all mental space. Previously, people could casually pick up newspapers or books, then return to daily life. But TV created immersive entertainment that trapped people, making escape impossible. Gradually, people stopped reading, stopped pondering serious issues, even stopped deep conversations. This is how television completely reshaped the public cultural environment. Since entering the 21st century, technological progress worsened rather than improved public culture. This time, the main culprit was the rise of internet media. Over the last 2 decades, while boosting media efficiency, the internet drastically reduced its quality. In the internet era, media content got drastically compressed, even down to 140 characters, Twitter's word limit. In this extreme format, reports often become just strong emotions and eye-catching opinions. Detailed evidence and nuanced arguments become optional. Thus, this media format inherently harbors anti-intellectual elements. Worse, conservative religious and political forces exploit these anti-intellectual traits, even amplifying them. Twitter's brevity and immediacy perfectly serve irrational crowds who dislike deep reading but love bandwagons. Recently, Republican conservatives used Twitter to mobilize large numbers of narrow-minded people to champion anti-science views. This explains Trump's obsession with governing via Twitter. The author argues Trump repeatedly lowered public rationality through his tweets. After losing to Biden, Trump repeatedly tweeted unfounded claims of election fraud, urging supporters to protest in D.C. On January 6, 2021, this culminated in a violent assault on the U.S. Capitol. In this cultural climate, both parties pander to vulgar tastes, evident in politicians' speech styles. Pre-mid-20th century, political speeches were solemn, dramatically elegant, and literary. Today, speeches mimic grassroots language, slang, celebrity quotes, all to appeal to the less educated. Internet technology, especially mobile internet, profoundly changed media environments, making Americans less willing to value rationality, critically examine social media, heed expert advice, or confront anti-intellectualism's consequences. In traditional media, like newspapers and TV, mainstream outlets prioritized authoritative knowledge sources. Thus, disseminated knowledge almost exclusively came from professionals. But in the mobile internet era, anyone can run self-media platforms and freely share opinions. And today's self-media platforms overflow with fake news and post-truth, filtered and processed versions of reality. In this environment, lower education correlates with poorer information discernment, making people vulnerable to rumors and conspiracy theories, cementing biases against expert opinions. For instance, since the 1990s anti-vaccine movement, many American parents believed MMR vaccines caused autism. Despite no scientific link, during COVID-19, many rejected expert advice, refusing lockdowns, masks, even denying hundreds of thousands died. These anti-intellectual Americans preferred believing COVID was an enemy conspiracy over self-reflection. Now, that concludes our interpretation of the age of anti-intellectualism.
The author contends religious and political conservatism are anti-intellectualism's true drivers.
TV and internet media proliferation accelerated this anti-rational tide. Notably, some views in the book lean toward excessive elitism. For example, the author's predominantly negative stance on entertainment culture, equating pop culture with intellectual regression and societal decay, deserves scrutiny. While TV and internet entertainment reduced reading among middle classes, they also provided accessible cultural products for lower classes, expanding their recreational rights. I think, thus, evaluating this requires comprehensive consideration. Some critics argue the book inadequately explains religion's enduring influence in America. New York Times reviewer Michiko Kukutani notes it fails to clarify why America is so divided on abortion, gay marriage, stem cell research, and evolution education compared to Europe. The deep reason lies in America's entrenched North-South divide. As explored in I Have a Dream, this book discussed how post-Civil War Southern states developed deep-seated resentment toward Northern oppression. This makes the South hostile to Northern ideas, fearing assimilation while defending Southern values. This crucial North-South dynamic is missing from the book's perspective. The New Yorker stated, "The author foresees a desperate future. Without better education, Americans will know less and less."
The author believes reversing this requires experts speaking out, plus public awakening to make fact-based decisions.
The book concludes, "Whether ignorance will eclipse knowledge is the critical question every American citizen must now confront." That concludes our interpretation of the age of anti-intellectualism. Study notes are below the audio. See you next time.